It was a bitterly cold morning in the village of Thal, nestled among the wooded hills of Austria. The windows of a modest home fogged from the contrast of the icy air outside and the weak heat inside. In that small house, shared by a family of strict values and simple expectations, a young boy named Arnold Schwarzenegger was already awake. Not because he had to be, but because he wanted to be. Even at that age, there was something different about him. An inner tension, a fire too. Big for the four walls around him. Life in Thal was not easy. Arnold's father, Gustav, was a former police chief and a man shaped by war and discipline. He ruled the house with order and demanded conformity. There were chores to be done, rules to be followed, and dreams. Well, dreams were considered luxuries. In his father's eyes, a proper life meant joining the military, settling into a steady job, and blending in with society. Ambition, especially the kind Arnold showed, was not welcomed. It was seen as foolishness, as rebellion. But Arnold didn't argue. He simply knew, deep inside, that he was not meant to blend in. He was not born to be ordinary. He didn't fight against the system openly. Instead, he trained. Quietly. Patiently. He trained not just his body, but his mind. He began lifting weights at the local gym, often alone, often in the cold, with equipment that was rusted and improvised. There were no protein shakes, no sponsorships, no cheering fans, just a boy and his relentless will to become something, more than what life seemed to allow. While his friends dreamt of becoming police officers or shopkeepers, Arnold stared at the faded pages of American fitness magazines he'd managed to get through friends who traveled. On the covers were towering men like Reg Park and Steve Reeves, men with sculpted physiques, powerful auras, and dazzling smiles. But more than that, they were symbols of escape. They had used strength to change their destinies. Arnold didn't just admire them. He studied them. He memorized their routines, copied their diets, and pasted their pictures on his bedroom wall. In his mind, it wasn't fantasy. It was a roadmap. Every day after school, he would ride his bicycle for miles, just to reach a weight room with a few machines and rusty dumbbells. There were no coaches, no fanfare, only an unshakable hunger. He trained for hours. Not because someone was watching, not because anyone told him to, but because he had already seen the future in his mind, and he knew the only way to get there was through sweat, sacrifice, and obsession. At the age of 15, he made a decision, perhaps the most important one of his life. He decided to become the best bodybuilder in the world, not just in Austria, not in Europe, in the world. He wanted to win Mr. Olympia. He wanted to go to America. He wanted to become a movie star. To anyone else, it sounded ridiculous. A boy, with a thick accent, no connections, and barely enough money for gym clothes declaring he would conquer the globe. They laughed. Teachers, neighbors, even his own father dismissed it as childish nonsense. But Arnold didn't react with anger. He reacted with intensity. Every insult, every doubt, every dismissive glance only sharpened his focus. He used rejection the way some people use fuel. It made him burn brighter. The more people told him he couldn't, the more determined he became to prove that he could. When he turned 18, Arnold entered the Austrian army to fulfill the mandatory military service. Most recruits saw it as a pause in their lives, but not Arnold. He smuggled weightlifting equipment onto the base. He woke up before drills to train. He curled ammunition boxes and bench-pressed heavy iron plates long after others had collapsed into their bunks. During his service, he found out about a junior bodybuilding competition in Germany. He wanted to compete. The army said no. He went anyway, AWOL. He hitchhiked, competed, and won the title. He returned to face punishment, but instead of being discharged, he was given special permission to train for future competitions. Even the army saw that something was different about this kid. After leaving the military, Arnold began entering more international competitions, and he started winning. His body, now chiseled and symmetrical, was drawing attention. His confidence, however, drew even more. In interviews, he didn't shy away from his dreams. He told the world he would move to America, win Mr. Olympia, and become a Hollywood star. The media treated him like a novelty. But underneath the smile was a razor-sharp mindset. He was preparing, always preparing. Then came the day he had waited for. At age 21, Arnold boarded a flight to the United States. He had a single suitcase, a few dollars in his pocket, and a heart full of iron. He didn't know the culture. His English was broken. He had no job security. But he had vision, and that was enough. When the plane touched down, he stepped onto American soil not as an immigrant, but as a warrior with a mission. This wasn't the beginning of his journey. It was the continuation of a path he had already walked in his mind thousands of times. He moved into a small apartment in Santa Monica, California. He trained at Gold's Gym, the mecca of bodybuilding. Surrounded by legends of the sport, Arnold didn't try to blend in. He aimed to dominate. He trained twice a day, 6 days a week. He experimented with diets, supplements, recovery techniques. He took notes, watched film, and worked on his posing as if preparing for war. Bodybuilding wasn't just about muscle for him. It was art, discipline, identity. In 1970, Arnold won his first Mr. Olympia title in New York City. He was just 23, the youngest ever to win the sport's most prestigious title. But one victory wasn't enough. He would go on to win 7 times, rewriting the rules of the sport, becoming a global icon in the process. He wasn't just big, he was magnetic. He walked into a room, and all eyes turned. His charisma, confidence, and ambition were contagious. But even at the peak of his bodybuilding career, Arnold never forgot his other goals. Hollywood was always on his mind. Becoming a movie star wasn't just a dream, it was the next level. The same people who had doubted his bodybuilding career now laughed at his acting ambitions. "You can't act," they said. "Your accent is too heavy. You're too muscular. You'll never be cast." But Arnold didn't flinch. He trained his voice, he studied scripts, he enrolled in acting classes, he read books about the industry. He didn't just want to be in movies, he wanted to conquer them. It took time, years, small roles, bad roles. But he was patient. Then, in 1984 it happened, he landed the role of a lifetime, the Terminator. He played a nearly silent, emotionless machine, yet his performance left a permanent mark on film history. The line, "I'll be back," became legendary. Audiences were captivated. Hollywood, once skeptical, was now begging for more. From there, Arnold's career exploded. Predator, Commando, Total Recall, Kindergarten Cop, hit after hit. He proved that muscles could sell tickets, that charisma could override accent, and that discipline could silence every doubt. He wasn't just a bodybuilder anymore. He was a box office titan. But Arnold's story didn't end there. Because for him, success was not a final destination. It was a tool, a platform. In 2003, he shocked the world again by running for governor of California. And he won. The boy who once trained in an icy garage in Austria now led the 5th largest economy in the world. His life had come full circle. But even now he knew his real mission was to inspire. And that brings us to this moment. Arnold, now older but just as powerful, stands backstage. The lights dim. The crowd waits. He's about to give a speech, but he doesn't hold a script. He doesn't need one. Because the story he's about to tell is one he's lived. He walks onto the stage, and the applause is deafening. But when he begins to speak, the audience quiets. They're not here for catchphrases. They're here for truth. Arnold looks out over the crowd and begins. "I come from a small village in Austria. No money, no connections, just a crazy dream. And when I told people what I wanted to do, they laughed. They said it would never happen. But I didn't listen to them. I listened to myself." His voice is calm, but commanding. Every word lands like a weight. There's no exaggeration, no act, just truth. "I had nothing. No money. No fame. No special gifts. But I had a vision. And I had work ethic. That's what matters. Not where you start, but what you're willing to do. Every morning I woke up with a plan. Every night I went to bed with progress. The room is silent. I'm not special. I just didn't quit. You don't need perfect English. You don't need perfect conditions. You need commitment. You need to be willing to work when no one is watching. I wasn't lucky. I was focused. There's no cheering. Just silence. Not because the audience is unmoved, but because they are deeply moved. They aren't just hearing Arnold's words. They are seeing their own reflection, realizing that excuses have no power unless you give them power. Arnold pauses. He lets the silence stretch. I've had failures. I've had setbacks, but I never let them define me. I built my life through sweat, belief, and relentless discipline. And if I can do it from nothing, then so can you. The crowd doesn't erupt immediately. They just sit there, many in tears, many nodding, many speechless. Because in that moment, they've heard not a motivational speech but a mirror, a reminder that greatness is possible. And it doesn't come from talent, it comes from choice. The lights dimmed as Arnold paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the hearts of every person sitting before him. He scanned the crowd slowly, making eye contact with strangers who now looked at him with a mix of awe and self-reflection. The silence in the room wasn't empty, it was powerful. Every person in that hall was processing their own limitations, their own excuses, and reimagining what could be possible. Arnold hadn't delivered a speech. He had struck a nerve, and yet he was just getting started. He leaned into the microphone and said, "You know, I came to this country with $20 in my pocket, a gym bag, and a heart full of dreams. No one rolled out a red carpet for me. In fact, the door was barely open. I had to break it down, not with luck, but with consistency." The audience was locked in. They'd heard stories of success before, but this one hit differently. Maybe it was the simplicity. Maybe it was the grit. Or maybe it was the fact that he didn't present himself as a superhero, but as someone who made decisions others were afraid to make. "When I entered Hollywood," Arnold continued, "I was told, 'You'll never make it.' They said my body was too big, my name was too strange, and my accent? Forget about it, they told me. No one will ever understand you." And you know what I told them? I said, "I'll make them understand me." A few chuckles rose from the crowd, but they were not mocking. These were smiles of admiration. People were beginning to see that the thing that made Arnold different was the very thing that made him unstoppable. Arnold took a few steps across the stage, no longer just speaking, but commanding. You don't need everyone to believe in you. You just need to believe so strongly in yourself that it becomes contagious. I wasn't trying to be like everyone else. I was trying to be the best version of myself. That's where real success starts. As the words spilled out, he wasn't just reflecting on the past. He was creating a map for others to follow. The crowd already knew the highlights. They had seen The Terminator, Predator, Total Recall, and a dozen other blockbusters. They'd laughed with him in Twins and Kindergarten Cop. But now they were seeing the man behind the mythology. A man who had once lived in a tiny apartment, who wrote down his goals every night before bed. A man who practiced every scene with a hunger that left nothing to chance. A man who read, studied, observed, and refused to accept mediocrity in any form. "I didn't care about being the best actor at first," Arnold admitted. "I wasn't trying to win Oscars. I was trying to break barriers. I was trying to show that someone who sounded like me, who looked like me, could lead a major motion picture and pull in millions of dollars at the box office. I wanted to prove it to every kid out there who didn't fit the mold." He stopped walking. His voice dropped just slightly. "You don't need permission to succeed." That one sentence dropped into the room like a weight. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't complicated. But it shattered every excuse that people had carefully constructed over the years. Arnold's life was the embodiment of that line. He didn't wait for someone to validate his dream. He didn't ask the world to change for him. He became so powerful that the world had no choice but to change. People kept saying, "Ma, you're lucky." But they didn't see the work. They didn't see the early mornings, the missed holidays, the years where I made less than minimum wage because I was building something that no one else could see. He paced again. They saw the movie premiere, but they didn't see the rejection letters. They saw the success, but they didn't see the sacrifice. I had to become what I wanted before the world ever saw it. And then, with only the quiet hum of the lights above them, he transitioned. But bodybuilding and acting were just the beginning. I always believed that if you grow, you must give. That's why I got into politics. Not for power, but for service. I wanted to give back to the country that gave me everything. Some people in the audience hadn't followed his political journey closely, but Arnold had served as governor of California for 2 terms, overseeing one of the most complex and diverse economies in the world. He tackled environmental policies, infrastructure, and education, not because it was easy, but because challenge was part of his DNA. I remember walking into the Capitol building for the first time, he said. And I told myself the same thing I said when I walked into Gold's gym. I'm here to work. I'm here to improve. I'm here to lead. The crowd was now silent, not out of politeness, but out of reverence. It was hard not to respect someone who had reinvented himself so many times and each time with such unwavering focus. I didn't care if I was underestimated. That just made it easier to over-deliver. That line echoed. Arnold paused, letting the truth of that idea land. He knew the people in front of him weren't all aspiring actors or athletes, but they were dreamers. Or maybe they had been dreamers before life, bills, responsibilities, and fear took over. And now, this speech wasn't just about his journey. It was about theirs. You see, I'm not telling you my story to impress you. I'm telling it to remind you that your story is still being written. You can rewrite it anytime you want. You can flip the script. But you've got to pick up the pen. Eyes were welling up. Even seasoned professionals, CEOs, students, parents, people from all walks of life were hanging on to every word. They were thinking about the things they gave up on, the businesses they never started, the books they never wrote, the risks they never took. Most people don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they lack commitment. You don't need to know every step. You just need to take the first one, and then the next, and then the next. Arnold's voice was steady now, like a general before battle, like a coach before the final round. Do you know what the real secret is? He asked. It's not motivation. It's not talent. It's not even intelligence. It's consistency. Day in, day out, when no one is clapping, when no one is watching, that's when champions are made. He looked around the room again, his eyes sharp. Everything I've done, every movie, every title, every office I've held, it all started with a decision. The decision to start. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be relentless. That word hung in the air. Relentless. He took a breath. The room seemed to lean in almost unconsciously, as if trying to absorb every remaining drop of wisdom. You don't need a fancy gym. You don't need the best camera. You don't need the perfect script. You need desire. You need discipline. And you need to stop waiting. The room was no longer silent out of politeness. It was sacred. People weren't taking notes. They were committing it to memory. Not just what he said, but how he said it, with fire, with truth, with lived experience. Then Arnold did something unexpected. He smiled, broad and genuine. The kind of smile that comes from someone who has walked through the fire and come out forged. You can become anything, but only if you believe it before the world does. Only if you work for it when no one's clapping. That's when you earn it. He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, letting the moment breathe. Then he walked forward again, his posture tall and firm. And remember, your accent, your background, your failures. They're not obstacles. They're your edge. Your scars are proof that you survived. Now show the world that you thrived. A thunderous wave of applause erupted. Not the casual clapping of agreement, but the soul-shaking ovation of people who had just been transformed. People were on their feet. Tears. Smiles. Some shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe the depth of what they had just experienced. Arnold didn't wave like a celebrity. He didn't take a bow. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at the people he had just touched, not because he needed their approval, but because he believed, genuinely, that one of them might take what they heard and use it to rewrite their own destiny. He slowly left the stage, the applause still ringing behind him, but in that crowd something had shifted. People were no longer thinking of Arnold as a movie star or politician or bodybuilder. They saw him as proof that the impossible is possible, that you don't need permission to pursue your dreams, and that with vision, work ethic, and the courage to begin, you too can leave the world speechless. As the auditorium slowly emptied, the echo of applause still seemed to hover in the air like a lingering vibration, refusing to fade completely. But inside the heart of one man, seated in the fourth row, slightly off-center, the speech wasn't over. It had just begun. His name was Daniel Reyes, 36 years old. A software engineer by trade, and a once promising athlete turned quiet soul with a life slowly drifting off course. No one knew it by looking at him. He wore the usual, clean button-down shirt, polished shoes, the polite expression of someone accustomed to fading into crowds. He had driven 2 hours to get to this event. Alone. No one knew he was there. Not his wife, not his colleagues, not even the few friends he still kept in casual touch with. He hadn't planned to come. In fact, for weeks the ticket sat in his inbox, unopened from a forwarded email. But something had made him click on it at the last minute. Something deep. Something whispering through the noise of his routine. You need this. So he came. He came because he'd been stuck for years, trapped in the invisible quicksand of mediocrity. Once, Daniel had big dreams. He was going to open his own startup, launch an app that changed lives, train for triathlons, and maybe even write a book. He was full of ideas, ambition, vision. But life had chipped away at all of that. There were the rejections, the layoffs, the responsibilities. The small voice in his head had grown louder with every failure. Maybe you're not cut out for this. And eventually that voice became law. He settled for safe. Safe job. Safe choices. Safe life. But deep down, it was killing him. Not dramatically, not tragically. Slowly, quietly. But tonight, something broke. Or maybe, something was finally rebuilt. When Arnold said, "You don't need permission to succeed," Daniel felt as though someone had placed a defibrillator to his chest. It wasn't just a line, it was his line. The one he'd been waiting years to hear, though he hadn't known it. The way Arnold had spoken, calm, grounded, unstoppable, Daniel saw himself again. Not the man he had become, but the one he used to believe he could be. That fire, that edge, that hunger. It had never left. It was just buried, and now it was awake. He didn't leave the auditorium right away. He sat there long after most people had gone, listening to the janitors in the back begin their slow work of restoring the room. His fingers clutched the worn leather of the chair arms, eyes staring forward, though there was nothing left to see, only a new voice now, his own. For the first time in years, it wasn't filled with excuses. It wasn't questioning. It was deciding. He got up, slowly, walked out into the cool night air. But instead of driving home, he sat on the hood of his car beneath the parking lot light and opened the Notes app on his phone. He wrote one word at the top. Start. Below that, he wrote 3 things. Wake up at 5 a.m. and run. Reopen the app prototype. Email the publisher. They weren't dramatic. They weren't perfectly structured, but they were action. And that's what Arnold had taught him. It's not about being perfect. It's about being relentless. By the time Daniel got home that night, something in him had shifted. His wife noticed it. The way he walked in, the way he carried himself. No slouch in his shoulders, no defeat in his eyes. She looked up from the sofa and asked, "How was the speech?" He smiled. A slow, thoughtful smile. "Life-changing," he said, and he meant it. In the weeks that followed, Daniel became a man possessed, but not in the way of madness, in the way of purpose. He woke up before dawn every morning and ran 2 miles, even when it rained, especially when it rained. It made him feel alive. He dusted off his laptop and reopened a prototype he'd abandoned 2 years ago. A language learning app that used emotion-based memory cues instead of rote memorization. Everyone had told him it was too niche, too complicated. But something Arnold said had stuck in his brain like a hook. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be relentless. So he worked, every night, even if it was only 45 minutes. He committed. He didn't announce it on social media. He didn't tell friends. He just showed up, again and again. On the 20th day, the app crashed and deleted 40% of his work. He wanted to throw the laptop across the room, but instead, he stared at the screen, grit his teeth, and remembered something else Arnold had said. I didn't care if I was underestimated. That just made it easier to over-deliver. Daniel didn't give up. 2 months later, he had a working beta version, and on the same day he finished it, he sent a cold email to a language learning blog that had once featured a similar concept. He didn't expect a reply, but he got one. 3 days later, they asked to interview him. A week after that, their post about Daniel's app went semi-viral, just enough to get 1,000 beta signups and attract a few educators who reached out offering feedback. Within 6 months, Daniel had partnered with a retired linguistics professor and a small startup incubator that offered him seed funding. It wasn't millions, but it was enough. Enough to take it seriously, enough to quit his job, enough to remember what dreaming felt like, and all of it, every single piece of it, traced back to one night, one speech. Arnold would never know. He might never hear about Daniel Reyes, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Daniel now saw himself differently, and so did his wife. So did his friends. People started asking him what had changed. Some assumed he read a great book. Others thought he had landed a secret opportunity, but it wasn't any of that. He had simply decided to start. And he started because someone, once a long time ago, stood on a stage and reminded a room full of strangers that they didn't need permission. That their pain wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. That their past didn't define them. Their next decision did. That voice still lived inside Daniel's head. And over time, he began to share it. He gave his own small talks at local meetups, at a university club, then at a community entrepreneurship conference. And every time he stepped up to the mic, he shared a single story, a moment in time. A night when a man named Arnold stood before a room and spoke so honestly, so fiercely, that it burned away the fog in a broken man's life. And without fail, people would come up to Daniel after and ask, what did he say that made the difference? Daniel would smile and reply, it wasn't one line. It was who he was. A man who didn't let limits define him. A man who told the truth about success, that it's earned in silence when no one's watching, and you have every reason to stop, but you don't. And then he'd pause and say, the moment I heard him say, you can become anything, but only if you believe it before the world does. Something in me woke up, and I've never let it go. Word spread. His app grew. Eventually, he started his own podcast, The Relentless Mind, where he interviewed everyday people who'd made powerful changes in their lives. And one day, 2 years after that speech, he got a call. A representative from the foundation Arnold Schwarzenegger supported had heard about Daniel's story. They wanted to feature him in a video about personal transformation and grit. Would he be willing? Daniel said yes, without hesitation. And so, there he stood again. On a stage, lights in his face, cameras rolling, not as a spectator this time, but as the living proof of what a single speech could do. He shared his story, this time not for applause, but for impact. Because he knew there were thousands of Daniels out there, men and women sitting in quiet desperation, waiting for a sign, a spark, a reason to believe again. And as he finished his talk, he looked into the camera and said, I'm not here because I was smarter, or faster, or more talented. I'm here because I finally listened to the right voice, and that voice told me, start. Far away, maybe on a movie set or in a boardroom, Arnold might have been carrying on with his day, but in the hearts of those who heard him, really heard him, his voice was still echoing, still changing lives, still making people speechless, and that was his greatest legacy.